talk about writing a very long autobiography, some 8 volumes up to the age of 30 so far, and available on Amazon and on my website www.alanmcfarlane.com under Life. I want to talk about the methodology which I gradually established to do this, because I had to think of something new. Basically, there have been lots of autobiographies, of course, hundreds of them, and many of them brilliant, and I couldn't possibly write books like those. But they are all based on memory, with occasional scraps of information, sometimes almost total recall, most famously people like Proust, obviously, and Compton Mackenzie and Vade Mehta and so on. And indeed there's a very nice collection, if you're interested in these things, by Walter de la Mare called Early One Morning, Chapters on Children and Childhood, as revealed in early memories, memoirs and early writings. So there are those, but they are basically people sitting down and writing all that they can remember and triggering new memories and then going on like that. These volumes take a different approach. They're not a chart of a changing world through what I remember of it 30, 40, 50 years later, or even Wordsworth's Prelude 10 years later. But because I can't do that, I don't have a particularly good memory and so on. But they're based on social history documents. I'm a historian, and that's what my trade is. So without the documents, I don't speculate. Luckily, I have saved many thousands of documents to cover this 30-year period, about 70 A4 boxes, as I've mentioned elsewhere, plus many photographs. Central to all this are letters. Letters are a wonderful source because you're trying to explain to someone else what you're feeling. In many ways they're even better than diaries, which are explaining to yourself, and therefore you take a great deal for granted. But letters are an amazing source, and fortunately I have a wonderful collection of letters, not my own, which are okay, and I have a lot of them and they get better, but particularly my mother to me. The accident of her being in India for much of the time, married to my father, a tea planter, and writing to me almost every week when she was away, long, chatty, amusing, concerned sort of letters, because not only did she write, but she was an excellent writer, and it's clear that she thought of these letters as a kind of autobiography or notes for later writings, and therefore she put her real art into these letters, and they are extremely rich, witty, observant and interesting. And throughout these volumes, right to the end, it is her letters in many ways that are the star items in my autobiography. There are also many other letters from other people, and particularly 2 sets of letters from girlfriends when I was at Oxford, and my letters, because I was taught from my first boarding school onwards that I must write a letter a week to my parents, whether they were in England or India. So I kept a lot of these, or rather my mother kept them, and so there's the 2-way correspondence between us. And then the next sort of source are everything else. Basically, from about the age of 14 or 15, I kept all my schoolwork, essays, fragmentary stuff, and particularly at Oxford and afterwards, all the ways I was thinking about life through writing about history, English, writing bits of poetry and so on, and I have it all. And so there's a huge amount of that material. Then there's lots of ephemera of different kinds, everything from quite extended pieces down to bus tickets and receipts for small sums of money I spent and so on. So it's a very diverse collection, supplemented by a lot of photographs. My family sent photographs to each other because they were often apart, and so the collection has remained, and the books are illustrated with those. The real question is how you possibly organise this stuff. No one has, as far as I know, ever tried to do it for themselves, so how do you do it? Well, gradually I learnt, particularly persuaded by Sarah, my wife, that the best method, if possible, is chronological. You want to see the story developing. You want to, it's like a novel. You need to actually understand day to day what is happening, and this gives a kind of tension to the events and hopefully interests the reader. So most of the volumes are chronological. The first one on India, first years in India, is chronological, and all the rest, except for two. These are the Dorset days, when I'm describing my life from coming home to England at 5 until 13, and the sequel to that at home in the Lake District from 13 to 18. The latter, the Lake District one, is half chronological, and the half by themes. The Dorset days is by themes, and also the first boarding school, the Dragon School, Becoming a Dragon book, is also mainly by theme. This is because there really isn't quite enough material, dated material, to do it date by date by date. So those are by themes. So 3 by themes and 5 chronologically. What I've tried to do is to look at all this as if I was a historian from outside, and looking at myself as just a person who produced a set of records. And so I've tried to let the documents speak for themselves, not to interpose myself there. If it needs clarification, then I've done that, but otherwise I've just let it speak for itself, and letters often do that. I've usually put in all the names, but I've shortened the names of the 2 girlfriends, and so they're slightly protected, and I've just left out tiny bits, hardly anything, 0.01% of stuff which might be hurtful, damaging to people who are still living, has been omitted. This appears to be objective and dispassionate, but I'm quite aware that, in fact, I have had to select, and the selection is subjective, things that are more interesting, that I remember partially, and so on. So it's not entirely objective, but as objective as I can possibly be. The advantage, though, is something which the great historian Mark Bloch mentioned, that history works best if you can get several sources bearing on the same subject, and then you can cross-check the accuracy. And in a lot of cases I do have different eyes looking at the same subject or bits of paper relating it to it, so I can check the objectivity. This is, as I mentioned, as far as I know, unique. It's through a set of accidents that I've managed to maintain or keep all this material. And what it shows, I think one of its features, is the accidental nature, the fortunate nature of a life, where you never know what the next turn may bring, who you may meet next, what event will change your life. And so it's a stumbling forwards, and that stumbling forwards is also true of the methodology. When I started this 10 years ago, I really didn't know what I was going to do, and that it would turn out into such a long book, a set of books. And I evolved the methodology, and one of the purposes of these talks is really to share that with others who might find it exciting to do something similar on a bigger or smaller scale than this. And when I started also 10 years ago, it was scarcely possible to do this. I'll explain this elsewhere. Methodological or technological changes in the last 10 years alone have made what I've done possible. It was barely possible at the beginning, and it is now not too difficult. So I will explain that. But I'd want to end by saying that it looks easy after the event, but actually it's taken a huge amount of effort to work out how to do it above all, and then of course to do it. And without Sarah's help I couldn't have begun to do so. So that's